The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. The Pool Guy Podcast Show. Yeah!
Hi, and welcome to the Pool Guy Podcast Show. In this episode, I'm going to go over some ways you can save money with your variable speed pumps, not only with how you set it in replacing a single speed pump, but I'll go over some money-saving tips as far as upgrading to which variable speed pump, and some realistic savings that you're going to get by using a VS pump. If you're considering upgrading to a VS pump, I think this podcast is definitely for you. Pool Service Pro, open a Leslie's wholesale account today and receive wholesale pricing on products you use every day. Leslie's Pool Supply offers convenient locations that are open 7 days a week. Another great benefit of opening a Leslie's wholesale account is Leslie's referral program. Get referred to a customer looking for weekly pool service. Save time and money and grow your pool service route and become a Leslie's Pro. And I was fortunate to be one of the first to use a VS pump when they first came out. A lot of builders were given the Pentair IntelliFlow, and there was one installed on my route. And I was one of the first users of this pump. Now, of course, they've come a long way since the first generation. There was some problems with the alarm going off when it lost prime. You may have one of these still on your route or on your pool, and you know what I'm talking about when that alarm goes off and then the pump's dead for the whole week. But other than that, they've definitely improved quite a bit since the first generation of VS pumps. In fact, Pentair was so revolutionary that even Jandy, with their Aqualink system, included them in their owner's manual. So it had a section, I believe it was page 33 or 34, somewhere there, about how to connect a Pentair IntelliFlow VS pump to the Aqualink system. So it was definitely something that Pentair jumped on, and they lead in the market, I think, because they came out first. They do make a really good pump with the IntelliFlow VS, the WhisperFlow VS, and the SuperFlow VS. Not that Jandy and Hayward make a pump any less in quality. You'll find that most of these have either a Century motor, and some of the newer ones have a Nidec motor on the back. And this is important to note because I'm going to touch on some ways you can save money when upgrading to a VS pump as well. And that name Century and Nidec, just keep that in your memory. But first I want to touch on the realistic savings of a variable speed pump. I know on the manufacturer website, I think Pentair says you can save 90% on your energy use. Others say 80 or 70%. I think mostly about 80%. This is true if you run it at the low speed without any high speed programming, which to me is extremely unrealistic. When Pentair first came out with their pump, and the reason why I mentioned that I was one of the first to use it, their recommendation was to leave it at 1600 or 1500 RPMs for the whole day, and there was no need to run a higher speed. It was one of those things that was going to save a ton of money, but there were a couple of drawbacks with running it at such a low speed. Well, there were several drawbacks actually. The first one is the pool looked terrible. If you ran it at 1500 RPMs like they had originally suggested, the pool just would not be cleaned. It would have dirt on the bottom. The suction cleaner wouldn't have enough power to move. The skimmer wouldn't pull in enough debris, and it made the pool look like it's been off all week, basically. So that was the first problem with any kind of suggestion of a low speed only. Again, I mentioned the suction cleaner wasn't working. They need about 2400 RPMs to really move in the pool effectively. And if you have a pressure cleaner connected and you're using a VS pump, you would want to have it running about that speed to get enough water flowing to the booster pump to run the pressure cleaner. And saltwater generators generally don't have enough flow until you're at 1800 RPMs. And so basically running it at 1600 RPMs, you had no saltwater generator, no cleaner working in the pool, the skimmer wasn't pulling any water in. And yes, you saved 80% of your energy costs, but it wasn't a realistic way to run a variable speed pump. And in reality, you really can't run it at just a low speed all day because all of those things won't be functioning. The pool will look terrible, and it's just not necessary. Because if you really wanted to save 80% of your electricity costs, maybe you're better off just getting solar panels on your roof, because to get that kind of savings would compromise how the pool looks overall. So I would suggest running 2 speeds on a VS pump, one at 1800 RPMs, that way the saltwater generator turns on, and then a secondary speed, which I call a medium speed, and I don't think there's a need for a high speed in most cases, but a medium speed of anywhere from 2400 RPMs to 2600 RPMs. Now, if you run it like this, you're not going to save 80% of your energy use because you're running it at a little higher speed on the low speed, and then you're running at medium speed, and you can throw in a high speed there every day if you wanted to for a couple hours. So I would say realistically, if you're looking at setting it for a pool environment that's in the real world, I would say you're going to save maybe about half the electricity of a single speed pump, or maybe even 40% only, depending on how you run it. The energy savings are there, but to get to 80% that the manufacturer has on their site, you're going to compromise the look of the pool and just the overall cleanliness. I wouldn't recommend that, and I would say there is kind of a medium ground where you're going to save at least half the electricity cost, which in my book is good. If you can save half the electricity cost on your pool pump, it's definitely worth it. Now, upgrading, are you considering getting a manufactured pump like Pentair, Jandy, or Hayward? Or maybe you're going to pick one up on Amazon. And I would say I'm not opposed to the off-brand pumps. You just have to know their limitations. A lot of them won't communicate with automation, and a lot of them are made by companies that are not really companies that you know here in America. For example, there's a pump on Amazon called Chloro-Works, and this pump is selling for I think $800 or something like that. And I can tell you from the look of the pump that this one is probably manufactured or branded by Emox, which is a company that makes equipment in China. They've been around probably for about 30 years. Not a bad brand. They make some branded equipment for Raypak as well, but it looks especially like an Emox VS pump. And then the Black & Decker one is the same one that you would see for the CircuPool SmartFlow VS pump. I'm not exactly sure the manufacturer of that one, and I wouldn't say it's a bad pump. I've used the CircuPool version of that pump. You're just not going to have a lot of the bells and whistles you would have with a manufactured pump. And if you are on a budget and you want to buy an off-brand VS pump, I can't argue against you doing that. You're still going to save money over the single-speed pump, but I would gather that they're not going to last nearly as long as, say, a Pentair IntelliFlow, which I've had some original generations on my route, which would mean that they're close to 20 years old or so, maybe a little bit older or right around that time. So they're going to last a very long time. And the manufactured pumps, as I mentioned earlier, the motor on the back is made by either Century, and then some of the newer VS pumps, Nidec is making a lot of those motors, which is a former company that was called US Motors. Actually, it's still the same company. They're just using their Japanese branded name, which is Nidec. And it's one of those things, Nidec, I guess. It's one of those things where, if you've been around the industry a long time, you recognize US Motors. Old-time pool guys know what they are. And they're pretty reliable. They're actually made in Mexico now, I believe. I know that last time I talked to the rep, they were moving their plant to Mexico, which would make for a little more oversight in their production. But you can definitely get a Century, A.O. Smith, V-Green VS motor for I think about $700, just the motor part. And then you have to make sure you get the right flange, either square or round. Most people have square flanges, like for the WhisperFlow, the Pentair WhisperFlow pump. And then Nidec makes the Neptune variable speed motor, and that's around $700 also for that. The NPTQ 270 is a 2.7 horsepower motor that Nidec makes. So if you're thinking, well, if the Jandy, Pentair, and Hayward pumps have a Century motor or a Nidec motor, then it's probably a good motor. And if I just want to replace the motor end of it and keep the pump, it wouldn't be a bad idea. And I would say you're right, it's a good motor, just that the drive on back or the interface controller is not going to be the same as the Jandy speed set. You're not going to have all the bells and whistles. It's just pretty much cookie cutter controller on back. The V-Green pumps, I don't think they've changed their particular controller in years. And then the Nidec Neptune one is really good as well. I like both of those. They're just simple controllers. They're not going to interface with much, but they're going to run the pump, especially if it's a standalone pump. So I'm getting ahead of myself here, but when would you know when just to go with the motor on back? Now, it's a money-saving idea for sure, because then you don't have to replumb it, and there's no need to buy the complete pump and motor like the Pentair IntelliFlow, version 3 or the Jandy Flow Pro, because you're just gonna keep the same pump and take off the old motor, single speed motor, and replace it with a comparable total horsepower motor, either the Century V-Green or the Neptune variable speed pump based on your horsepower. So if you have a 1.5 single speed motor, you can definitely go with the Century A.O. Smith 1.65 V Green, and that's model number ECM16SQU, and that'll be perfect to put in there. You just take the bolts off your pump, put on a new seal, take off the impeller, put on a new seal, and put everything back together. In fact, I have a video on my channel that shows you how to do this with the Neptune pump, the Nidec Neptune, and you can definitely refer to that. And I think it's one of the things that you can do because they're definitely a reliable company. They make the motor for the major manufacturers already, but you're going to sacrifice the high quality controller. And I think that's the main thing you're sacrificing. Plus you're using an old pump. So if your pump is 10 years or newer, I would say this is a perfectly acceptable thing to do. But if you have like a 15 or 16-year-old Whisper Flow, I would recommend that you just get a Whisper Flow VS and drop it in there. That way you get a complete new wet end, because those do wear out. They do age out, and especially the Whisper Flow ones. So I wouldn't necessarily say that you should do it in every case, but if your pump, I'm going to say 10 to 8 to 6 years old, it's perfectly fine to take that single speed motor off and drop in one of these pumps, just the motor part with the VS drive on the back. Then you can get away with saving quite a bit of money. And this is for a standalone setup only. I wouldn't recommend doing this if you have automation. I would just go with a whole new VS pump in that case. But if you wanted to save some money, this is the way to go. And they're reliable. They're going to be long lasting, just like the motors that are on the back of the major manufactured pumps. And it's a good way to save half the money basically. And also it's easy to do. You could probably put one on in about 30 minutes. And it's a do-it-yourself project in some ways. You can, of course, hire someone to do it for you, but it's not a difficult procedure or project to take off your single-speed motor and then to put on one of these two branded VS motors. I probably wouldn't buy any variable speed pump, complete pump, one of these non-known brand name ones. If it's selling for less than $700 or $800, you're probably not getting a quality product. The old saying, you get what you pay for, is really true, and I think you're better off getting the VS motor and replacing that and keeping the pump instead of getting a cheap VS pump and motor combination. I've seen some at Home Depot for like $300. I think it was like $397 one day. It was on the shelf, and I was thinking that's probably not going to be a high quality, long lasting variable speed pump at that price. A lot of them don't have a lot of head power either, so they're not going to be able to push the water the way your old pump did. So be wary of that it's not going to have the same kind of power if you are buying one of these cheap pumps. And I would say if you have a Pentair Whisper Flow, I would get the Whisper Flow VS, in a heartbeat, or you can get an IntelliFlow. The reason why I recommend with the Whisper Flow you stay with Pentair is because you can just drop in the new pump because it'll line up with the inlet and outlet. And this, of course, makes for easy installation. One of the biggest hurdles of changing your single speed pump to a VS pump is the plumbing, especially if you're in a tight area like California where everything is in a small little equipment area. So having the inlet and outlet line up makes things very easy. So switching from a Whisper Flow to a Whisper Flow VS is perfectly acceptable. And the Circuit Pool, the Smart Flow Pump, and the Black & Decker should line up with the Pentair Whisper Flow as well. You can find, maybe the chart where your current pump will upgrade to a VS pump with the same inlet outlet. Hayward has a chart. Jandy has a chart on their site of which pumps line up to which old single-speed pump inlet and outlets, which I think is an important factor to consider when you're putting it in there, because you may not have a big area again to swap out the pump. Swapping out the pump where you can line everything up is much easier. Pentair came out with the first dual voltage pump in the Pentair Superflow VS, and I think a lot of manufacturers jumped on the bandwagon after that. Now, you got to understand that the Superflow VS was 1.5 horsepower, so it was actually a perfect pump for the dual voltage, because you may not know this and you may know this, but if you have a dual voltage pump that's 2.7 horsepower, it's actually not going to give you that kind of output as far as total horsepower, because if you're hooking up a 2.7 total horsepower pump to a 120 volt system, it's going to modulate that particular horsepower down to about 1.65 or 1.5. So you're really just wasting your money if you're getting a 2.7 dual voltage pump for 120 volt setup. Now the reason why the Pentair made the Superflow VS dual voltage is because the 1.5 horsepower was designed to replace a lot of single speed pumps on 1.5 inch plumbing. In fact, the whole Superflow lineup was designed to replace those old brass pumps with 1.5 inch plumbing. If you've been around as long as I have, you know that the pools in my area all had brass pumps, the Purex brass pumps, and there was other ones that were there, but they don't have a lot of pull on them, and they're made specifically for 1.5 inch plumbing, which is great because then you're not going to have any problems. But if you were to put in like a Pentair IntelliFlow VS into a pool where you have 1.5 inch plumbings where you had a brass pump, it was just too much head power for that system and it would cause problems. And so the Superflow was a perfect pump for the older pools with the brass pumps with the 1.5 inch plumbing. So that's why they made it dual voltage, because a lot of those old pools had 120 volt breakers controlling the equipment, and a lot of times you couldn't connect that to your equipment. But then, of course, if you had a 230 volt equipment pad and you wanted to use the Pentair Superflow VS, you can easily use it because now the voltage automatically will set it for either 120 or 220 volts. And it's one of the things that I think is a great feature to have on the pump. However, you're wasting money if you, again, buy a 2.7 horsepower, let's say you buy a TriStar VS, and you put it on your equipment pad when you have 110, 120 volts, you're not going to get the 2.7 total horsepower. You're going to get maybe 1.6 or 1.5. So you're really just wasting your money buying something like that. Now, it's smart and it's good to have that ability so that there's no error. You can, if someone were to buy that and put it on, it wouldn't cause any problems, because before that, if you put on a VS pump that was only made for 220 volts, you would have a problem and it would overload the system and it would probably burn out the pump pretty quickly within like 30 seconds or so. Not that I've ever done that before, but I know that the motor doesn't last very long when you have the wrong voltage set, and it's something that you have to be aware of. I would say if you have a 1 horsepower motor right now on your pump and motor on your pool right now, getting a 1 horsepower or 1.5 horsepower VS pump is perfectly acceptable. If you have a 1 horsepower pump and motor and you want to go a little higher, I would go with a 1.65 horsepower or 1.85 total horsepower. Those are perfectly acceptable. I keep forgetting to say total horsepower, but I think you understand what I'm saying here. And if you have a 1.5 horsepower single speed pump, I would say a 1.85 total horsepower or a 2.7 total horsepower pump would be perfectly fine. And if you have a 2 horsepower single speed pump, I definitely would go with a 2.7 or a 3 total horsepower VS pump. You basically want to match the current horsepower you have now with the VS pump you're going to purchase, so that it's an easy transition and you're not wasting money buying something that's oversized. And you're going to really find that even with the lower horsepower, if you had a 1.5 and you just went to a 1.65, you're not going to notice any difference in the way the pump runs. If you have a water feature or a spa, it'll be basically the same. It's like pretty much apples to apples at that point, and you really don't need to get a 2.7 if you don't need it. There are certain things that you have to consider getting the higher horsepower pump, as far as you're spending more money on that pump, and you may not need the features or the total horsepower of that particular pump. So of course you can save money by just getting the VS motor. You can save money by just getting the horsepower that you need and not spend money on a more expensive VS pump if you don't need it. And you can also save money on how you run the pump. If you run it realistically, you're going to save about half your energy costs. And I would say 80% is pushing it, and you definitely want to run it long enough for your saltwater generator to activate. So your low speed shouldn't be anything below 1800 RPMs if you want that saltwater generator to kick on and start producing chlorine while the pump is running. Now, would I say that if you have a single speed pump that you should upgrade to a variable speed pump? I wouldn't say necessarily you would want to do that. I mean, if spending a little bit more money on your electricity bill is not a big deal, then I don't see a reason to upgrade really. If you have a 1 horsepower whisper flow and that motor burns out and you want to get another 1 horsepower motor, I would say that's perfectly fine. You won't save any money on electricity, and that motor won't last as long as a VS motor. The VS motors last a lot longer because they're DC and they're really built and you can, of course, modulate the speed. And that's some of the reasons why they last longer. They're also totally fan enclosed motors now, which means that they're a lot more weatherproof, and so that's going to make them last longer. Whereas if you just get a single speed 1 horsepower replacement motor, it may not have all those bells and whistles, and it may not last as long. But I would say upgrade if you want to. You shouldn't upgrade unless you want to upgrade to a VS pump. And of course, there's the Department of Energy law or regulation that makes you upgrade anything greater than 1 horsepower to a VS pump. But there's, of course, single speed pumps available out there for you, even at a 1.5 horsepower. And it's not the end of the world if you're using a single speed pump. I just think you're not going to maximize your savings. And a lot of times, I think it's definitely worth upgrading if you have the money, at least to get a VS motor on the back of that pump, or to a full new VS pump and motor. I don't really see a hesitation if you have the resources to get one, but I understand if you are happy with your single speed pump. There really is nothing compelling. I don't think that's going to make you upgrade, except maybe the regulations that you can't get a single speed pump. But I would say, in my case, I have 2 VS pumps on my equipment pad, and I really enjoy the energy savings they provide. And to me, I wouldn't put a single speed pump on my pad going forward. And I think the benefits of the VS pump really outweigh the cost of it. You can run the pump longer at lower RPMs, meaning that you get better circulation, better water quality. The pump is running a longer period of time and you're saving money, which is a win-win. And there's really no reason not to, because you're going to actually earn the money back, because you're not going to be switching out or swapping out that single speed motor every 3 or 4 years. And believe me, this is the reality. I've had pools where I've put 3 or 4 different single speed motors on over the course of 10 or 12 years. But with a VS motor on the back there, it's going to last 10 or 12 years or longer with really no problems or no issues to speak of. So again, it's not like you're spending the extra money for a variable speed pump and you're not getting any benefits from it. That's not totally the case. You're getting a lot of benefits, 50% of your energy savings, plus you're getting a pump and motor, or just the motor itself if you're buying the back end of the pump by itself. That's going to last a very long time. If you're looking for other podcasts that I've recorded, you can find those on my website, swimmingpoollearning.com, on the podcast icon. Click on that for 1,400 episodes you can listen to at your leisure. And if you're interested in the coaching program, you can learn more at poolguycoaching.com. Thanks for listening to this podcast. Have a great rest of your week, and God bless. Real quick, if you're not using pool service software, try Skimmer free for 30 days at getskimmer.com/poolguy. Again, that's getskimmer.com/poolguy. Skimmer, everything you need to run your pool service business all in one app. Pool Service Pro. Open a Leslie's wholesale account today and receive wholesale pricing on products you use every day. Leslie's Pool Supply offers convenient locations that are open 7 days a week. Another great benefit of opening a Leslie's wholesale account is Leslie's referral program. Get referred to a customer looking for weekly pool service. Save time and money and grow your pool service route and become a Leslie's Pro.